Hello, everyone. Welcome back to another Whiskey Advocate tasting series. I know we normally do a two-bottle tasting, but we've got something really special for you today. We've only got one bottle because it's so unique, so incredible, so special. I'm Keith Goldston, Master Sommelier, and I've got my partner in crime with me today, Travis Hinkle. Travis, welcome back. One bottle, what the heck? This is crazy. I mean, why is this one so special? What's the deal? Who are we tasting?
Yeah, thanks, Keith. Really excited to be here. So we are joined again by Jim Beam Distillery, and today we're talking about Little Book. Little Book is a really exciting project that they've put out for the last 5 years. So this is the fifth iteration called Chapter 5, The Invitation. And what Little Book is all about, it is about sort of unique and creative philosophy behind blending. So with this fifth iteration, we've got four different spirit components, three of which are Kentucky straight bourbon and one that's 100% malted rye, all bottled at cask strength. So really fun, really unique project, and I'm super excited to be talking about it today.
Yeah, very cool. And as you said, Jim Beam, to me, it's just a treat to sit here and, the fact that we're going to get to chat with Freddie Noe coming up here in just a moment. But the fact that this is a family distillery that has a history of a couple hundred years, I think they've been making bourbon longer than we've been a country, which is pretty darn cool. And that Freddie is eighth generation distiller. So pretty amazing. It doesn't get much more Americana than this with an iconic beverage with one of the legendary producers. So I guess with no further ado, let's introduce Freddie Little Book Noe himself and, kind of share the Little Book story with us. Freddie, welcome to the show.
Yeah, glad to be here. Thanks for having me on. It's always a great opportunity for me if I get a chance to talk a little bit about family history and continue on and talk about Little Book as well, kind of the things I've started to work on. So I appreciate that.
Yeah, Freddie. So we know that Jim Beam kind of has a lot of different unique projects, but this is the first one that you've kind of introduced as your first major contribution as part of this new generation. You want to tell us a little bit about the project?
Yeah, I mean, it kind of come from an idea when I first got an opportunity to spend some time in the distillery um, around, we use corn, rye, and malted barley to in the mash bill to make Jim Beam and a lot of our bourbon products. Um, but I had a thought: if what if you took the whiskeys of those individual grains and blended them together after aging, and would it taste like bourbon, or how closely would it may even taste to Jim Beam if you use the same percent? Um, blended whiskey in America in the kind of recent history hadn't had a very good a good light on it, right? It's kind of been known as a cheaper thing. So my dad kind of thought I was silly to ask that question, but it came up again, or it came up in my head again when we had an opportunity to do a new innovation, and I shared the idea, and people kind of thought, well, why don't you go to work and try that out? And I guess the rest is kind of history. It started with chapter one, which was called the Easy, and I thought it was a very easy sipper for a cask strength bourbon, or excuse me, a cask strength blended whiskey. Um, and I called it, when I said bourbon, is I called it a bourbon style blended whiskey. So it had a lot of elements of that idea, and stemmed from what I said as a young distiller, just trying to understand how the distillery worked a little bit. So um, here we are on the fifth chapter now. So a pretty good story into my journey as a distiller and as a kind of young kind of whiskey, just lover of whiskey, and someone who wants to learn more and more as they can about the whiskey making process.
Yeah, well, I'm very curious because it had to be, I mean, you grow up in a legendary family. I mean, your grandfather is, one of like, the Whiskey Hall of Fame, and then your dad did, some pretty amazing innovations as well. And I look at it from like the wine side, and I think it's fascinating that your grandfather came up with these cool little small batch collection, and then your dad comes out with stuff like, apple, devil's cut, and then stuff that actually like moves literally moves the needle on sales and getting bourbon out in front of a bunch of people. And it's just amazing to see that kind of spectrum of super geeky, kind of high end, but then also, you know, stuff for people who just are new to whiskey in general. So, how have you kind of come out of that shadow to find your voice and tell your story?
I think a lot of it is you kind of look back at history, and there's a lot of people that have touched the brand, the family, and also the business. But for me, just learning what I can from my ancestors was kind of first and foremost. And I think when you kind of take that approach and understand that you're carrying a torch of a very long tenured um, family in this industry. I will real quick correct the country was 19 years old, so couldn't have a legal drink whenever we first started making whiskey, but it was established as a country, just very, very young. Um, but there's a lot to learn from that, and a lot to kind of help take forward, and a lot of things that you start to question. And I think, as you saw in kind of what Little Book and how it came about, those questions a lot of times can lead to some very interesting whiskeys, and in this case a very new brand for us, for me as well. So I think a lot of it was coming in and not letting the pressure sit on your shoulders. Come in and do what you were meant to do, right? Which was learn whiskey, learn how to make bourbon, and learn about my family's history and kind of how to take that forward. And that kind of carved my own path within itself. Just kind of letting my what was right in the natural way take its course. And that's kind of how I found my path, was just not trying to demand something, not trying to set out to prove anything, just really to set out to learn, and learn about whiskey.
Oh, perfect. And our the bourbon nerds out there watching us will know that, of course, Booker's bourbon is named after your grandfather, but Little Book is actually named after you. Would you explain the connection there?
Yeah, when I was born, from basically the time I was born until my granddad passed away, that was the nickname that he gave me, and called me. And then after he passed, others in the family, my mom and dad from times, and my grandmother quite a bit, would call me that. So it's a name that kind of stuck with me throughout. And then as we were working on this project, I was kind of sharing with a larger team a little bit of what my thinking was. And when I was telling them that I thought it needed to remain at cask strength, because I really liked the way that the flavor was coming together, and that it kind of goes back to the essence of what my granddad was doing with bringing whiskey back to the way it used to be, and the way in his eyes it was meant to be. People used to bring jugs to the distillery and just fill them up straight out of a barrel. We didn't bottle, and there was no kind of bottling strength. So I thought, if I'm going to kind of step out of the history, the major history of what my family has done in making bourbon, and do a blended whiskey, I thought it was kind of only fitting, the more I tasted it, that I kind of follow that same mantra, because it was something that was very unique as I was doing the development on this first project, and all these projects. Each one kind of takes me in a different direction, and so I thought, by leaving it at cask strength, it was very fitting for the consumer to enjoy it, literally any damn way they please, right? From cask strength all the way down to as much water or ice, or even I've had quite a few cocktails with Little Book in them that are very good. So um, it came up that should be the name, that someone had read in that book that he called me that as a child, and so they thought, if Booker's is cask strength, and your product's going to be cask strength, your nickname is the best fit, and it kind of locked in from there. And no one ever really questioned it after.
So I find the whole Little Book story fascinating, and Freddie, thank you for sharing that. I know the first chapter was trying to almost recreate the mash bill, but with finished whiskeys, which was a very cool thought. What's the inspiration as you go into different chapters? Where do those ideas come from? I mean, I think one of the chapters you even were playing around with Canadian whiskey was kind of cool, and something you almost never see done here in the U.S. And then playing around with like the malted rye on chapter 5. Walk us through that process because it's really kind of cool and exciting, and you got a pretty big, fun toolbox to play with, I'd have to think.
Oh yeah, absolutely. I think what's really cool about Little Book, at first we didn't call it Chapter One. We picked that up with Chapter Two, but it's a pretty cool story because it's kind of each one is telling a segment of my life in whiskey, right? So, Chapter Two, as you alluded to, had Canadian whiskey in it, corn-based Canadian whiskey, and also rye-based Canadian whiskey. But I happened to be working on another project where they were looking at use of Canadian whiskey with the company, and they said, "Would you like to go learn how it's made and processed?" And so, as I alluded to earlier, I love the process of whiskey making, and so it was an opportunity for me to kind of showcase to people that I really am honing my art of whiskey making and want to learn more. I've since visited with Shinji and the Japanese whiskey team, but a lot of it too. I've
Cool.
also picked up some more techniques and learned how Japanese whiskey was made, but also my own techniques in doing blending as well. And you see that, and so chapter 3, 4, and 5 have been a little bit closer to home. Chapter 3, I was actually told by my boss to limit my travel because I just had my son, who is now actually goes by Booker. So now we might have a little bit of a confusion on our hands of who's Little Book and Booker. So that'll be interesting when we get a little bit older. But um, yeah, so it gave me a chance to work on those whiskeys that he created, and so I was really inspired by being home. And so there was a blend of the small batches. The first one, there was actually a blend of bourbon, so it was still categorized as a bourbon. Chapter 4 was, a lot of what I learned about my grandfather in whiskey making came from my dad. So he really inspired me to kind of, in chapter 4, he actually helped pick one of the whiskeys out blindly. He didn't know he was doing that. Um, but but it was about honoring him in that as well, because a lot of people compare me to my grandfather, but without my dad and the knowledge that he picked up and the respect that he had for his dad and learning from him, I wouldn't have the kind of understanding that I have about whiskey making from him and from granddad's perspective. So I wanted to honor dad in that chapter. And then here with this one, it's kind of an invitation, as the chapter alludes to kind of some of the whiskeys that I've been working on in the distillery. So the 2-year-old bourbon that goes in there, kind of an eye shocker for a lot of people to see a 2-year-old bourbon coming from us, and also in a prestigious blend like Little Book. But also the 3-year-old malted rye is a project that I worked on that may see the light on another brand in the future. And then the 5-year-old bourbon that's utilized was actually made during my time as a supervisor in the distillery. So, and it was just some Jim Beam at cask strength. But so it's kind of the 3 of the 4 whiskeys that go into this blend were kind of made under my watchful eye, were curated from some of my innovation thoughts. So it's an invitation into kind of the future of some of the things. But also, I think across the chapters, you've seen things too come back and forth. So it's a good place for us to kind of maybe tease folks on some of the things we're working on, or may come out in the future, right? So it's really a good telling story of kind of as I said, the kind of journey of my life in American whiskey and maybe in world whiskey, as you see in Canadian whiskey, and then who knows in the future, maybe some uses of other ones, because I do have a lot of opportunities within the company to visit, Irish makers. As I said, I've spent time with the Japanese whiskey team. Also, there's tequila, cognac, scotch. So a lot of opportunity to continue to learn more about whiskey making, but also maybe to help kind of tell the story of Little Book and my journey within that, to give people something to kind of maybe earmark some of that learning I had based off of a whiskey called Little Book.
I've noticed that you've been sipping on it while we've been talking away here, and I'd just be curious what your thoughts are, what you're getting out of the glass. I've been enjoying mine. I'm just curious if you could pull out a few descriptors for us and share your thoughts.
Well, yeah, absolutely. And so, like we've mentioned a couple of times, this is bottled at cask strength. So I think on the label here we have 116 proof or so. So that's definitely coming.
116.8.
Point eight, yeah, and that point
Yeah.
eight is important for sure.
Point eight makes a big difference.
No question. And I mean, what that kind of results in is this really fully flavored, very aromatic, bourbon style of whiskey. And so you get everything that you want out of a great bourbon. You've got the baking spices, the vanillin, with these great sort of herbal and kind of grassy notes that I assume is coming through with that rye, which I absolutely love in this. And getting it on the palate.
Absolutely. You're spot on with your attributing that to that malted rye. That's a very good assessment.
No, awesome. I love it. It adds a real complexity and kind of nuance to it. You get it on the palate, and again, because it's at that full barrel strength, it is completely palate kind of coating. Really, really powerful. And I love this because, like, look, if you're a bourbon purist and you're dialed in and you're that geek, drinking this straight out of the bottle will be something that's really interesting and rewarding. But this is also something that hitting it with a splash of water or enjoying it over ice, you're still getting a fully flavored bourbon that isn't going to be overly diluted, even with that little contribution of water from the ice. And while I would hate for this to be buried in like a really complex cocktail, I think making this into an old fashioned, just seasoning it with a little bit of raw sugar, a little bit of Angostura bitters, you're going to get the real nuance of the whiskey, but make it a little bit more approachable as well. So it's nice because you can really choose your own adventure with something like this.
So Travis, great tasting notes, and one thing that I think that's really kind of cool about this is like looking at it through the wine window again is I think of wines made in a Solera where you combine old vintages with young vintages, and we've got that saying of the old wine educates the young wine. And I kind of love just the energy and the vibrancy of the 2 year in the blend, and you taste it in that mid palate. It just boom, it's really big, but then it goes into this super mellow, long, smooth finish. And I have to think that's like the 15-year-old being like, whoa, relax a little bit, chill out there. Like, we're in this for the long haul. Like, let's enjoy it. So, Freddie, just great job with the blend. It's really kind of a fun mix of that young and old kind of playing together. Was that your intention?
A lot of it, when I go to the blending, I had the idea of bringing about some of these whiskeys that I had, as I said, had kind of curated from distillery on. As I started to play with these whiskeys, exactly what you described started to play out, because some of the percentages I would utilize, the young whiskey would just be very dominant, and take away from that finish that if you taste this 15-year by itself, to your point, it's got this very nice long finish that's kind of very mellow, and it almost makes you wonder if it's going to overwhelm you, but it just continues to be a very low, warm sensation versus a very, overpowering one, like a much younger whiskey would. So I started to see this playing out, and the tension was very tough to break, to be quite honest. But I think I got to a good place and cracked that code. And listening to you guys lay out your tasting notes, I think you're very spot on with a lot of what I was looking to pull out in this whiskey. And that's one big thing for me with Little Book. When you go about blending it, and it's very tactical in an approach when you can't blend, right? Or it should be a little bit, because you're purposefully putting things together. So I like to make sure that elements of each of the whiskeys is really a kind of pulling through. The one thing is the 5-year-old kind of has the body length that kind of gets you from that front to mid palate back to that deep, rich finish that's coming through. So each of these whiskeys kind of brings a very strong attribute to the final blend. And it was great for me to kind of listen to you all go through those notes, because that's exactly what I want to hear, is people dissecting it and breaking apart those individual components and figuring out where those notes are coming from. So very great job. I would almost write them down and put them on the back of the label myself, because like I said, it was just very spot on as to the notes coming from the whiskeys and how they play together. And like I said, I think it came together very well. And I guess the one thing I will add that I think Travis touched on early when he was speaking was a viscous or viscosity kind of coating of your palate. I really attribute that to that 2-year-old bourbon, where it was an opportunity for me to distill to a little bit lower proof, or quite a bit lower proof, than say Jim Beam or Booker's or Baker's come off the still at, and right off the still all the way through its aging, still very young. It has had that kind of viscous feel to it on your fingertips, across your palate. And it really is what I would attribute to kind of helping keep those whiskeys together from that flavor that's really kind of bouncing from the different ages and the differentiation in mash bill as well, and distillation proofs.
All right. Well, I just have to say, Freddie, Travis, this is great fun hanging out, drinking a pretty amazing whiskey, and I loving the chapter 5. The other 4 chapters have been amazing. I think Little Book's turning into a pretty big book, and it's going to be a pretty amazing novel when it's all said and done. And I'm really looking forward to the next chapter, enjoying this one. So, Freddie, big toast and tip of the cap for making something pretty special. Travis, always a treat to taste with you. And guys, do you have anything for us in closing? Because this was a fun little half hour to hang out and try some whiskey.
Yeah, no, Freddie, great to speak with you. I'm going to get my hands on a bottle for the house, and I can't wait to see what happens with chapters 6, 7, 8, and onward. So cheers to you.
No, cheers to you guys, and thanks for the opportunity today to join the show and talk about Little Book, a little bit about family history. Anytime that's an opportunity, I'm all in. So not to tease too much, but I'm finishing up chapter 6 right now, and maybe we'll have to get together next year and go through another tasting. Like I said, this has been a pleasure for me. So cheers to you all.
Yeah, cheers. Thank you so much. And, looking forward to maybe those days when the box set comes out where you get each of the chapters, because that'd be pretty slick to have sitting on the bookshelf. But thank you so much. Delicious.